Let's go ahead and do it.
Hey everybody, welcome. It is Thursday. We're all staying alive. I'm sure everybody saw the SFAR email that went out yesterday, and sort of as an add-on to that, what we're hoping to cover today is talk about the nuances of showing property, best practices, what's allowed, what's not allowed. I know there's been a ton of confusion because things have changed so quickly, and so Neil and I put together this little presentation to try to just simplify everything and make it super clear, because we're all out there just trying to represent our clients and do our jobs. So Neil, you want to get us started?
Sure. So thanks again for everyone who came. We really appreciate it. Marcia and I both had the opportunities to show a little property yesterday, so we actually got to practice the information, and of course very grateful that SFAR sent out that email yesterday. So if you haven't had a chance to review the email from SFAR with regards to showing, please take the time. It's very well written with lots of good resources. So let's go ahead.
All right. So the general protocol that we're going to cover today is virtual first. And of course, we've all heard all about that, virtual materials. We're all thinking about how we're marketing properties as listing agents. We're going to talk about what virtual includes and what that means. And of course, there's been a lot of discussion about, you know, this word feasibility and sort of what sequence of steps needs to be taken when you finally get to a property in person, if you get there. Mm-hmm. So we're going to talk about virtual. We're going to talk about when you make the decision with your client to set up a showing, what to do at the property, what to do after you leave the property. And then at the end, we're happy to answer any questions. We will ask that people submit questions in the Q&A as opposed to the chat box, just so we can track that and make sure they all get answered.
And it looks like we already have at least one question.
Oh, good.
So people are finding it. Yeah, if you could remember to type into the Q&A box, not the chat box.
All right, so we're going to get started first. We are going to cover a lot of information in this. So what we'll do is if we see something that's come in as a question along the way, if we catch it, we'll attend to it during the presentation when we get to that topic. If not, we'll make sure we circle back at the end and get that addressed. All right. Okay, virtual first. Neil, you want to take us through what that means?
Yeah, so you know, the thing that we've come to know and love about sheltering in place still continues, and that is that everything should be done virtually if at all possible. Virtual tours are obviously a big topic that people are talking about right now. What are they? What are the best? What are our obligations? And so we still emphasize virtual first. Before anybody rushes out to see a property, they should have really done quite a bit of work. This shouldn't just be, oh, send off a Pede and let's go. It should really consist of multiple steps. And the first of which is going to be review. And so buyers should be encouraged to review all marketing materials virtually, as well as any disclosures and reports that are already available.
And I just want to make a note here, you know, as a buyer representative, I've come across, there's a big range of virtual materials that are out there for different properties. So, you know, it's really just important to talk to the listing agent and say, hey, give me everything that you have. I want to make sure my clients are able to view, you know, all the information that might be essential to them. And I'll give a personal example actually from the other day. I had clients looking at a property. They had viewed all the virtual materials, video tour, all the disclosures. They'd read everything. And there was something I ended up showing the property because they were very serious about writing an offer. And we got into the property and it was landlocked, and we saw the back, and it was actually, there was a deal breaker right out of the gate. And so I realized, oh, if we had had a Matterport, we would have been able to have that conversation virtually. So do your very best to try to, sort of as an agent, interrogate and think analytically about the property from these virtual materials and ask questions. Ask the listing agent questions.
Absolutely. Yeah, and there is a distinction that can sometimes be made and Marcia and I were talking about this yesterday, the difference between marketing materials and a virtual tour or a virtual impression of the property. Marketing materials, we're often highlighting the best features of a home, but part of what we're doing with virtual tours is really trying to give a prospective buyer the opportunity to rule out properties, because that's as important right now with protecting everyone as actually seeing the property. So just keep that in mind. Obviously, examples of virtual marketing materials are up on the screen. There's lots of them out there. You obviously we've seen everything from people doing their own photography all the way through professional video. And so that's obviously a great way for people to get an impression of the property. The next thing is go ahead.
Oh, just one other point about the marketing assets. I've actually seen situations where buyers agents are setting up a Zoom call with them, and they're presenting the materials and they're talking about them in live on a call, and really working through them. So, I think there are some creative solutions here that don't involve just handing everything off to your client and say, "Oh, go look at this and let me know what you think." Have a real conversation, take it as an opportunity to help them learn about the process if they're new. If they haven't written a bunch of offers before, this is a learning process for them as well.
Mm-hmm. And obviously this is a break in the way that we may have been doing business in the past, where it was very easy just to go in and see a property and rule properties out that way. Similarly, review all the disclosures and reports, right? So if galvanized pipes are an absolute deal breaker, you can usually identify that by reading the contractor's inspection. If there's a very large pest, that's something that can be addressed. If there's issue with topography, right, a grade, that's something that you might be able to learn by reviewing the materials that are provided ahead of time. Again, the goal here for it's not to convince buyers to go out and see everything, it's to identify the properties they're most likely to buy and save both you and your clients time. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide.
All right.
So then next, there should, before, again, we're still in that virtual phase. We haven't decided to go see the property yet. There should be probably a discussion about comparables, some serious conversations with the loan professionals if there's a loan involved in the process, and obviously any other issues that might affect the ability to close on the property. So availability of insurance, for instance. So these are all things that should be done before you go and show a property.
All right. And again, just to underscore this, because I find it in my own practice as well, that, these processes really help you develop relationships with your clients and also understand really what they're looking for and what the stumbling blocks might be. So while it seems like you're doing a lot more work up front, the reality is you're probably going to save yourself a lot of time in the long run. So there are some real benefits to this, and I think we're going to see those play out as well.
So next thing, again, not going to the property yet. We're going to investigate the neighborhood. You can drive by the property. You can learn a lot by seeing the property without getting out of your car and going into the property. Again, with the goal of ruling out things or identifying potential problems. Same thing, visit the neighborhood, make sure it's what your buyers are looking for, get a sense of the lay of the land. Again, before we've made the decision to go to the property.
And I will say the binoculars here was just a visual. We're not actually encouraging that, although it could be, if it's vacant, I think it could be fine. So
not creepy.
Yeah, not a creepster situation. Okay, so you've done all those things, and now your clients are really jazzed about it. They say, "This is it. We know this is the house for us. We want to go see it." So what does that mean? Basically, what that means is you're now in a stage where you're going to assess the plan for the property. And the plan is provided by the listing agent. And we're sort of looking at both sides of this during this presentation because we know many people on this call are also listing agents. So what does the listing agent need to do and think about in light of the new requirements? So what we have here is a list of items that are probably prudent for most listing agents to include, and there's actually a listing agreement addendum or amendment, depending on where you're at with your listing agreement, to cover how these showings are actually going to happen, and have seller agreement and listing agent agreement, and you set these standards up front with your client as the listing agent. So some examples, of things sellers may request: a pre-qual letter, proof of funds, A signed acknowledgement that the prospective buyer has reviewed all virtual media, like we just discussed. Also disclosures, like we just discussed. And then the CAR Pede form, which we're all very familiar with now, but we will get to in a little more detail, that's a non-negotiable requirement. So you want to make sure that you're requiring that of any prospective buyer who comes to the property, but also important to have a discussion with your seller about, hey, we want to make sure that we're not just having 50 or 60 groups through this property for fun. Right now we want to be diligent. We want to make sure that the buyers who come to the property can actually purchase or write an offer.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And it's important to make sure
Okay.
that we set those up ahead of time, right? These standards should be applied consistently across any prospective buyers, of course, keeping in mind the risk of fair housing issues. The plan, this is a concept that's come out in the OSHA guidelines that were recently published. I believe it was on May 7th, if I remember correctly. And so having this plan may be a conversation you have to go back and have, because maybe you've already signed up a listing, maybe you already started marketing. And so this is going to make some changes to the way that you are going to continue to market the property. But from whenever you implement the plan, it's important that you apply it consistently to all visitors.
That's right. And I would say, given the requirements, also, you're going to need to post this plan on MLS in some sort of public place for any prospective buyers to see. Also, I'd say consider including it in your disclosure package. I think that's prudent. Someone might notice it on MLS and then forget once they're digging through the disclosures because they're further along in the process. So just really important to have all of your materials consistent and to be sending it to every buyer's agent who contacts you about a showing. Just be transparent and then implement across the board. All right, and then we have an example. This is an example of the CAR plan. Now you could have a plan that differs slightly from this, but this shows you sort of the core elements. We've got the pictogram, which is the requirements we'll dig into a little bit more, and I'm sure you have seen this before at this point if you're on this call. And then the Pede form, which is also sort of a baseline requirement. All showings have to be done by appointment. And I know that we all love and miss open houses, myself included. We all love and miss broker tour, myself included. But the rules are that it's got to be done by appointment. If you are the listing agent, you want to space out the appointments a little bit. You're going to need to make sure that you don't have a bunch of people showing up to the property at the same time. Sometimes people come a little early. So I'd say, if at all possible, leave an hour or two between showings. That should be possible right now in general, but just be mindful. And then of course, when you're doing your marketing and everything, and I've seen some really creative things out there with Zoom interactive virtual tours that are happening, just be mindful of how you're framing that from a marketing perspective. Are you sending something out that says, hey, I'm having an open house? If the words open house appear in there, please make sure that it's very clear that it's virtual and you're not inviting people to come to the property, irrespective of if they show up with a Pede. I think that's just be mindful of that.
Yeah, it's I'd say the people that are attending this class as we speak probably are very responsible. They're mindful of what our obligations are, but it's also likely that there are some practitioners who are going to just be skimming through email and catch a headline that says open house or broker's tour, and if they don't also see the word virtual, then it may cause some of our fellow professionals to act in a way that's not in compliance with the new regulation. So we want to be careful about how we advertise showing. So we all want to get the property sold. We all want to get people to come see it, but we also want to make sure everyone's safe.
All right. On that note, if you are using a lockbox, which is allowed in certain situations, it is required that you cannot use a combo box, an old school combo box. you could use a Supra box, and the recommendation is to use the CBS feature, which was new to me. I had never used it before. And it essentially adds an additional step where you schedule the showing, the buyer's agent goes to the Supra on the property, they call the listing agent, they get an additional code to open the Supra at that specific time.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just an additional step. It's really smart. There's really no downside to it. It protects everybody. Genevieve, who's on this call from SFAR, noted to me that they do have Supra boxes in stock. I know they were out for a little while. So if you're interested in getting a Supra and you don't have one, just reach out to SFAR. And Genevieve, what was the email you wanted people to reach out to?
Hey, yeah, you can email mls@sfrealtors.com, and I'll add the email in the chat box right now.
Great, thank you.
Okay, great. And then they're mailing those out to people, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Great. All right. Okay, so you've decided to go to the property, your client's super excited. What do you have to do now? Well, you're gonna send them the plan. You're gonna say, hey, the listing agent sent me the plan, want to communicate, want to make sure you understand what the requirements are for going to see this property. One of the requirements is to make sure you don't have any active symptoms. And that's one of the things that the Pede form goes over, but we'd like to highlight a couple of them per CDC. Now, these are the symptoms that were active as of yesterday on the CDC website. Of course, we know things change. We're all following the news, but be aware if you have any symptoms or your clients have any symptoms that could be telling that that's a good reason to not go to the property.
Yeah, that's right. And, there's if those of you that have reviewed the Pede carefully also know that there's an obligation on the part of visitors to report back to the other agent and to the buyer's agent, the listing agent, if they subsequently develop symptoms or they think they might have come into contact with somebody who starts to display symptoms. So again, the public policy of all this, right? It's not really designed to stop you from selling real estate, but it is designed to try and safeguard people's health and well-being.
Okay, so you've done all of that. Everyone's monitored their symptoms. They are good to go. You arrive at the property, you meet your client. What needs to happen? And again, I enjoy sharing personal stories, and I think reality is a little different than the hypothetical. So it's fun. I sent my clients all of the plans and we went over everything. And of course, clients show up, they're a little crazy sometimes. They show up and you say, you didn't bring this thing. We talked about that, right? So I will say as an agent, and I fortunately had put some extra things in my car and I was prepared, but even though you shouldn't have to do this, put extra gloves in your car, put extra masks in your car, show up prepared because you've done all of this work and you want to show the property. And if your client shows up and they decide that day they didn't have gloves and they don't care, then, it puts you in a really sort of precarious situation. So just be prepared. Technically, I know it's frustrating. We shouldn't have to provide these things, but at this point, it's part of our job to help safely transact property.
Yeah, so the plan should be posted at the front door. I think at this point, everyone knows we're supposed to minimize touching surfaces generally, but high-touch surfaces in particular should be wiped down with a disinfectant in between sets of visitors. No physical marketing, so no brochures, no copies of the disclosure packet or the pest report should be sitting out because those inevitably become surfaces that people touch over and over and over. There should be some sort of hand sanitizing station provided, whether it's hand washing with soap and hot water or it's sanitizing the hand sanitizer. Those are both fine, but they do need to be provided. And again, something really important to keep in mind, if you are showing a property that is occupied, the occupant should not be present in the home during the showings. That was a big change. Before it was, we couldn't show occupied properties. Now it's the occupants can leave the property and then we can show, again, keeping in mind all the other guidelines, but don't show the property while occupants are still present.
All right, so you're at the property. Those were the listing agent things that they should be mindful of with the property. It's also what you should expect to find when you get to a property. If you're the buyer and the showing agent, and these shouldn't look new to you because they've been circulating quite a bit, but we'll go through them just in case. No more than 2 people from the same household. So, you know, I've heard of situations where people say, oh, but what about my parents who, you know, they've got adult children and they want their parents to come. And unfortunately, if it exceeds the guidelines here, 2 people from the same household, that's not possible right now at this stage. So just be thoughtful about it. And, you know, if you get into contract later and they want the parents to come back as a separate group, perhaps that might be an opportunity during an inspection period. So you've got 2 people from the same household and 1 agent. So if you're the buyer's agent and you want to go to the property with your client, or there might be an opportunity for a listing agent to play that role, I would say talk to the agent about that beforehand. Do they plan to be at the property? If they're the listing agent, coordinate. Maybe they'll open up the property and wait outside in their car, or just stand outside while the showing's occurring. So just coordinate on that front. When you're inside the property, practice social distancing, wear PPE, including face coverings and gloves, shoe coverings. I know the title companies, at least I've heard, they've been very generous lately, so feel free to give them a call on that front. And then also remember to bring some sort of plastic bags or something to discard the PPE afterwards. Now, I don't necessarily think listing agents are providing a space for that because it would be hazardous for them to keep the PPE on site potentially. So as the buyer's agent, I would just encourage you to bring a little trash bag, you know, and just clean up after your particular showing, tie it up, get rid of it. Bring your own hand sanitizer as a backup. And then when you're actually showing the property, when you open it up, open up some extra doors, open some windows, or ask that the listing agent open it up a little bit before you go in, and just make sure you have good air circulation. All right, this is a hot topic after the show. Who's responsible? I think I saw that show up in our questions. So the property is supposed to be wiped down, the surfaces, with some sort of sanitizing solution. In general, the guidelines imply that the seller or the listing agent or the person who is responsible for the property itself likely is responsible for this in some capacity. So what I would say is this, and I think there are a number of ways to accomplish this. When you're doing your listing agreement amendment addendum to figure out your plan, have that conversation at that time with your client. So if they're a seller, you say these are the requirements. If they're living in the property and allowing you to show it, say who's, you know, what would you like done between showings? Do you agree to sanitize it? Does the listing agent agree to sanitize it? Are you going to bring in a third party who's qualified to sanitize it? That could also be an option. I think it's a stretch to assume that a buyer's agent going through a property will sanitize the property. Unless you've discussed that explicitly with them, I would not make that assumption.
Agreed. Yeah, I wouldn't assume anything, because you know what happens when you assume. But it's not unreasonable for a buyer's agent, if they're willing to wipe down the surfaces and they have the appropriate sanitizing solution, to do so. And you know, while the OSHA guidelines make it the seller's agent's responsibility, you know, we're all in this together. We're all here to help protect our clients, our families, the occupants of the property. So if we can all work collaboratively instead of finger pointing, I think that's a step in the right direction.
I agree. That's a great point, Neil. Okay, let's go through our Q&A now and get to those, and then we can talk about our FAQs at the end, and then cycle back to some of the forms and talk a little bit more in detail about the Pede and other things if we have some time.
Sure.
All right, Nicole, can you accept offers subject to setting up an actual tour? The answer is absolutely yes. That is a very responsible approach. Certainly you could get into contract if somebody loves the property and write in a contingency for them to see it. And, as the seller, we haven't talked a lot about seller mentality right now on this call yet, but the truth is, if I had a property I was selling, I don't know that I would want a bunch of people traipsing through it. So I would feel comfortable saying these people are serious. Let's accept a good offer. Let's move forward and, work through it and get the deal done.
Agreed. Astrid asks, what are the responsibilities of the listing agent as opposed to the showing agent? Well, the listing agent has to prepare the plan and make sure that the plan is sent in advance of any showings to prospective buyers and their agents. Buyers agents have the responsibility of making sure that their clients have reviewed and acknowledged the plan and return that back to the listing agent in advance of showing the property. I think we went into some detail about the various responsibilities when you're at the property, but from a general level, ultimately, we want to make sure that people are complying with the plan. That is really a responsibility of the listing agent, but I really do feel that it's a joint responsibility. If you're a buyer's agent and your clients show up without a mask, there is some potential risk there. You want to make sure that they're complying with the plan in detail. So I do think there's some shared responsibility there as well.
And just to piggyback on that, I think one of the things I've seen done that's really smart is, you get a request for a showing, and then the listing agent immediately sends out a form letter that they have ready to go for the property. It says, this is the plan, these are the steps, these are the requirements. Please have your client sign off that they've read disclosures, reviewed materials. And then it facilitates that conversation as well about making sure everyone's on the same page. So just out of the gate, sending that email, making sure, as opposed to just relying on MLS and saying like, oh, we need a Pede. Smarter to actually start that communication transparently. Okay. Do we have a document that asks the questions? Have you viewed all the materials? Do you qualify financially, etc.? There is not a standard document in SFAR form, the forms library.
There's not a form that asks the questions, but when you sign the Pede, you are making an affirmative declaration that you have done these activities.
And I would also recommend, just as a best practice, and I know some of the larger brokerages have some versions of this circulating, it's basically a PDF that says, I agree, I've read these things. I agree, I've done this. I agree, I've done this. And then when you send the Pede, you just sign that, right? You have your client sign that. That just says, hey, you've done these things. This was the plan. We'll sign off on it. We're agreeing to it. You could also use a copy of the plan that the listing agent provides to you. So depending on which side you're on,
Yeah. And then Anna asks, is there a SFAR or CAR form provided for acknowledgement of virtual material? And I think that's a similar question to what we just answered. Again, the Pede is an affirmative declaration that you've reviewed the available materials and you're going to comply with the plan. The plan very often outlines, depending on whether you're using the CAR Pictogram or you're using a larger brokerage's plan or you've developed your own, it should address those questions.
All right. Are you only talking, this is Diane, are you only talking about vacant properties and not owner occupied property? So as Neil alluded to earlier, there have been some changes in the rules, nuanced changes in the rules over the last month. And as far as I understand, and Neil, correct me if your understanding is different, you are potentially allowed to show a property that does not current, that technically is classified as owner occupied with permission of the owner, seller, and or tenant. Tenants are sort of a sticky and other situation we can touch on in a second. Assuming they're not actually physically at the property and you have a Pede signed from them, the listing agent has a Pede signed from them to make sure that there isn't any confusion about contamination.
Yeah, and we did just touch on tenant occupied property. You can't force the tenant to permit you to show. The civil code, I'm not an attorney and I don't play one on TV, but the civil code that deals with showings for prospective buyers. Talk to your favorite tenant landlord attorney and get clarification on that. But I think that's my understanding is the courts aren't currently open. It's probably going to be a while before an owner can move forward to file petitions with the courts. So, working collaboratively, trying to come up with solutions that might permit a prospective buyer to see the property that's tenant occupied or occupied by somebody who's uncomfortable showing the property. And let's be honest, there's lots of legitimate reasons why somebody may not want to have their property shown. They may be in a high risk group. It may be very disruptive for them. They may be experiencing other hardship, and this can be quite stressful. So, I always encourage, if possible, to work collaboratively with the people that are involved. They can do virtual tours. They can do, a FaceTime for a buyer who's really serious. But don't just barge your way into a property and try and force a showing. That certainly is not in the spirit of this public policy, and certainly could get you in a lot of trouble. So be careful out there.
Neil, I'm glad you brought up the FaceTime tours. That was something I wanted to touch on. I think a great third option here is to ask the listing agent. If you're a buyer's agent, you have an interested buyer, ask the listing agent if they'd be willing to do a Zoom or a FaceTime walkthrough with you and your client. If you can limit the people who are coming through the property as a listing agent, if I had a serious buyer, I would say, I'm happy to go over to the property and do a virtual walkthrough with everybody before we even get to this next step, to make sure that that's logical for bringing in more people and having to go through these processes over and over. So just another option as sort of a hybrid scenario.
Yeah, that's good.
Okay. We answered that one. This plan for showing property by a listing agent should be drafted as a separate document on your broker letterhead and include in disclosures, ? So I don't know that legally it needs to be on the broker letterhead. I don't think it's a terrible idea to have it official. I would say if you're going to do that, I would consult with your broker and make sure that they're comfortable with whatever you're putting their information on, in terms of having people sign what appears to be a legal document. Neil, do you have any?
I mean, the pictogram that we have from CAR isn't on any official CAR letterhead as it is right now. The Pede, depending on your Zip Forms account, whether it's a brokerage provided account or the CAR provided account, may or may not have letterhead. So I don't think it's necessary that it be on letterhead. I don't think there's any harm, and certainly many brokerages have their own proprietary forms that they're using to address the question. So I don't think it's a requirement. Having a plan is a requirement. Providing it in advance of seeing the property is a requirement. Keeping copies of that, and including for people who don't ultimately submit an offer, is a requirement, so that can be provided. I would strongly suggest, just the risk manager and me, making sure you keep copies of everybody who went by to see the property, so that you have a paper trail of all the steps that you took in order to safeguard people, just in case there is, touch wood, that doesn't happen, but that there is a transmission and somebody is exposed to the coronavirus.
All right. Rebecca, is there a certain amount of time they have to be gone before it can be shown? I'm not sure if this refers to an occupant. I'm assuming this refers to somebody living in the property.
Actually, I think the question is between visitors. I think
okay, that's what I was. I was unclear on those two.
But we can answer both of them.
We can. Yeah, correct. We'll answer both. All right. I don't think there's a specific amount of time. I would say, as a best practice, I think it would be if it's an occupant, I would say ideally at least in a couple hours. But this is about opening up the property, airing it out a little bit, just being thoughtful. And if it's a showing back to back, if you have two showings, one of the larger issues there becomes what happens if someone's showing goes a little long, or what happens if somebody shows up early, which sometimes both of those things happen, and then you get overlap. So we're just trying to avoid overlap here. So as a listing agent, what you might say to somebody is, okay, you're in the 1 o'clock time slot. Just to let you know, I have somebody scheduled in at 2 o'clock. So make sure when you show up, that you're done at the property by 1:30 or 1:40. Just, be transparent about it and just work together to try to limit any sort of crossover, because you want to have time to go through and wipe the property down,
Yeah.
and to really follow the protocols and not just have back-to-back people coming into the property.
Yeah, I don't think there's, my recollection is that there's not an explicit amount of time that has to occur between visitors or the occupant leaving and the first visitor arriving. But you certainly have an obligation to make sure that you've fulfilled your responsibilities under the plan, which includes wiping down surfaces or having the appropriate person wipe down the surfaces and sanitize surfaces. So you need to provide sufficient time for that to happen.
All right. Astrid, what about a box on a post sign with statements?
So I think that's a flyer box. And, I don't think the OSHA document specifically addressed this, but that strikes me as having physical marketing materials at the property, and that is prohibited.
I will follow up to that. Another option that is not physical materials. I've been hearing about QR codes making a comeback. So you could potentially post a sign that you take a picture of with your phone, that pulls up some digital materials. If you really wanted something for people walking by a property, you think you're getting good traffic that way, I'd say, near your for sale sign, put a QR code up, have people take pictures of it. You're not going to have cross contamination. Okay. Carlos, could two people from the same household go in first, then third person go in afterwards when first two have vacated the property? So I think the intent of this rule, the law, is that it's disinfected between these parties. So this isn't explicitly attended to in the documentation, but given that it says two people from the same household, and one agent, I would say likely needs to be disinfected in between. Neil, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, again, there's some, I think the question on its face is simple. I think the third person I think they're suggesting might be a third person from the same household, right? So only two people from the same household at one time and an agent. And then there's this other person.
Okay.
Right.
Okay. Yeah.
Again, if we're going to strictly follow the plan and you're going to take the most conservative approach, yes, you should wipe it down in between. But if those three people came to the showing in the same car together, and they weren't following proper social distancing practices and wearing masks in the car, there obviously is some dubiousness to the practice. But as a rule of thumb, and I think from our point of view, yes, you should wipe down in between, even if it seems like extra work.
All right, anonymous attendee. Instead of a hand sanitizing station, can a listing agent provide a fresh pair of gloves to each person and ask them to dispose of them once the showing is done? Having all people touching the same hand sanitizer bottle doesn't seem sanitary. Well, I think that's a great question, anonymous person. And I would say, while it doesn't explicitly say this, I would encourage there to be gloves. And I would encourage you to have a conversation with the listing agent, if you're the buyer's agent, saying, hey, what's at the property? Just want to make sure I know what I need to bring, or be prepared. Like I said, I think it's smart to be prepared regardless. But in terms of substituting gloves instead of hand sanitizing station, the car pictogram shows that gloves are necessary. So I would say it's a really smart idea if you're the listing agent to provide gloves if you're able to get your hands on some, pun intended. Can't help myself. Do you need to sanitize and do gloves? We can be reasonable about what people are really touching and what the risk factor is, but I would say have soap at the property, have sanitizer at the property, provide gloves, do everything, help people comply in whatever way they're able and willing.
Yeah, and I'll just say, I know the suggestion that somebody touching a hand sanitizer bottle, having lots of people do that, seems unsanitary. But I think the theory is you're putting hand sanitizer in and then you're sanitizing your hands and not touching it again. So, unless it's a really powerful germ, they're use your best judgment, protect yourselves. I think that if there's sanitizer provided, it is recognized by the CDC as a way of reducing the transmission of the virus. Same thing with hot water and soap, right? Those are all acceptable ways of protecting yourself from being exposed to the coronavirus. Gigi says, thanks. Well, thank you.
All
I
right,
appreciate
good.
it.
Thank you. Yeah.
And then Daniel Hershkowitz asks, please confirm there is no requirement to have the plan signed. You implied otherwise. Danny from San Franny. So the plan that was put out by CAR is the pictogram and the Pede. It should be posted on the building. We don't require that people sign the copy that is on the building, but you would like to have some evidence that the plan was delivered and they've agreed to cooperate with the plan. So, if you're using that plan, you're obviously getting the Pede signed, and you should be asking that any visitors sign off on that, and that is a component of the plan. So to the extent that that is getting signed and you're collecting it on behalf of the seller or you're representing the buyer and you want to make sure that they understand their obligation, those documents are getting signed. If your plan doesn't have a place for signature, like the CAR form does, and your broker or your risk manager is okay with not having some sort of written acknowledgement of the plan, then that's their risk to take on.
All right. Okay. Bill, any insight into rentals, in parentheses, vacant rentals? I'm making them apply and sign the lease and then do the showing per all the rules with the tenant holding a contingency to walk away. Others seem to be showing rentals more casually.
So there is a Pede form specifically for rentals. There's a plan in place that you can utilize. Again, the goal, I think, Bill, you bring up a great point, that they should do as much due diligence before going to see the property as possible, giving a potential applicant the ability to, or a landlord to review the potential applicant's information to make sure that they would meet the rental requirements that the seller gets to set. Providing information in advance so that a prospective tenant has an opportunity to see virtual media, to review any house rules, condominium rules, anything else that might be tied up in the lease agreement, review a copy of the lease agreement in advance. And if both parties want to move forward and go ahead and schedule that showing and still have the ability to back out, I think is nice. I agree with you. There are probably some practitioners out there that are doing it more casually. I suspect that there are some of them who are not in compliance with OSHA's requirements. And so the only advice we can offer is do everything within your power to stay in compliance with public policy.
I'm going to jump down to the Q&A. It looks like Dan had a remark about the topic we were just on last, about the Pede confirming that the CAR and CDC guidelines are followed, but has nothing to do with pre-approval or any signature saying that they definitely are pre-qualified or have proof of funds. Just to speak to that point broadly, as a listing agent, think through who you want to show the property to realistically. I mean, I think, if you have a listing that you feel is going to sell for $2 million, is it to your benefit or your client's benefit to set up a bunch of showings for people who really aren't ready to go or qualified? So that's a discussion when you're doing that listing agreement addendum amendment. That's not a requirement of the law, but as a practitioner, it's probably a smart idea to set some guidelines around when you really want to be showing this property right now. So that's a great point, Dan. What he's saying there is if you sign the Pede, it does not mean you have proof of funds. It does not mean these other things. If you do have a plan that includes those requirements, which I think is a prudent idea as a listing agent, you might ask that prospective buyers sign that, and that's something that your seller is aware of and involved with, and those were decisions you made together.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Dan.
Okay, Gigi. Is this disclaimer permitted? Any party who enters the home must provide their own appropriate protective items and must enter at their own risk. We have seen this and actually agree because there is liability providing PPE. So the CDC pictogram that's often posted, and let me see if I can go back to this. Okay. Requires that you do these things. You're asking if it's basically if the listing agent doesn't want to provide or isn't going to provide the PPE, is it okay just to put a disclaimer? I mean, let's go back to sort of the heart of the issue here and why we're all doing this and why we care, right? I mean, we can limit liability and risk and do all these things, but at the end of the day, the purpose of this is to try to work together and protect one another and be safe and still sell real estate. So to that end, I would say they're signing the PPE, they understand the rules. Or sorry, not PPE. They're signing the PED that requires PPE. They understand the rules. In doing that, they're committing to that. So I'm not sure posting some additional disclaimer on the door is really serving a great purpose or value. I would say as the listing agent, have materials at the property. I would say as the buyer's agent, have materials with you, PPE. I understand it's additional cost, or have a conversation with your client before and say, hey, this is a requirement. You need to make sure you show up with these things. And like I said, from personal experience, even when you have that conversation, sometimes your clients aren't prepared and you have to go into your trunk and pull your stuff out. So just, we all pay for signs. We all pay for advertising. We all pay for mailers. We pay for a lot of things in our business. They're business expenses. And right now, if, this is a business expense to operate safely. I think if you're having problems getting these materials, I totally get it. PPE is hard to find and order and source right now. So if that's a larger issue, I think that's a conversation maybe we want to have at SFAR and get together and figure out good ways of supplying these resources and make sure we're operating safely.
Yeah, and I'll just take sort of a generic approach to Gigi's question. So the specific language you're asking about, I'd suggest you run by your broker manager or risk manager to see if it's appropriate or not.
All right, that was the short answer. Okay, Rebecca. A friend said in Contra Costa County, the seller who has to leave 3 hours prior. Okay, so Neil, you might be able to speak to different county requirements on this.
Yeah, there are different county requirements from varying between different health departments. Fortunately, there's been pretty much uniform approaches. To be honest, I don't know what Contra Costa County's requirement is, so I'm not going to speculate about the 3 hour gap. My understanding as it is right now is there has to be sufficient time for the responsible party to wipe down surfaces to ensure that there's minimal likelihood of transmission of the virus. But, I suppose it's possible that some counties have a specific time frame. Okay. And Matthew asks, what about vacant unit D? I'm going to be honest, I'm not sure what maybe that was a reference to a prior question, but could you, Matthew, if you're still on the line, if you can clarify the question, that would be helpful.
All right, we'll come back to unit D. Jim, had to take a client call, so I may have missed out on this. When will this be available, the recording of this session? It should be available in the next couple of days. SFAR has been really I think, good about posting these things. So there's a library, and certainly you could reach out to Genevieve. She can let you know when it's up. Sorry, Genevieve, I'm going to send everyone to you.
Well, and Jim actually withdrew the question later. I guess Genevieve saw that question. So thank you, Genevieve. Really appreciate it. Right. Anonymous attendee, the plan is basically the pictogram and the Pede together. So as of right now, that's CAR's guideline. I do understand that there are some revisions in the works some changes coming. So stay tuned. There may be an evolution of this particular pictogram. You may want to check back to the CAR website. That is the guidance they have offered. But again, check with your manager, broker, or risk manager to see if they have their own form or they have their own version of the plan.
I'm just going to skip down to this anonymous question about stagers really quickly. Do stagers have to follow the same requirements? I assume yes is the answer. Do they have to sign the Pede? The answer is yes. Stagers, anyone coming in to do work on the property, anybody who comes into the property has to sign the Pede. And that also involves us, involves agents. As a reminder, it's not just about the client. We're people too. And, you know, we present the same kind of risk as anybody else. So, you know, learn the Pede, learn how to explain the Pede to everybody. You're gonna have to talk to your contractors about it if they're coming in and out of the properties. Very likely, if you're having any work done by an organization that's structured, they'll have construction requirements to follow also. So kind of a separate issue, but these won't be new ideas to them. They'll have additional protocols.
Yeah.
All right.
And then Wilson asked, does this policy also apply to commercial properties such as office buildings and warehouses, et cetera? So the statewide requirement, yes, it's my understanding it does apply to all real property.
Okay. Fair housing. Dan reminds us, and this is super important, and I think we touched on it, but worth coming back to. You have to treat everyone the same. So you have a plan. It goes to everybody. You don't have a side conversation and say, I really like this agent, so it's okay. I won't do this, or I'll do. Just send the plan, follow the plan. There's a reason you wrote it. All of us are able to talk to our clients and explain that there are certain requirements for each individual property, and they are set by the seller and the listing agent. Okay.
And the law.
And the law.
Let's go to the last slide. I think we had a couple questions. I think we've worked through, unless more questions have appeared.
I think we've got a couple questions, but let's see. What is the listing agent to do if they cannot get a hold of gloves? So again, I know that's a challenge. I would say have a conversation with the buyer's agent who you're scheduled a showing with and say, hey, there aren't gloves at the property. Want to make sure you know that up front. Just, again, work together. Be transparent. You know, you may be in a situation where you have them at one point, someone else helps you out and has them at the property. You know, work together. Do your best. I do think it would be smart for some of us as realtors to get together and figure out how to acquire some PPE without taking it from other valuable resources who need it for medical purposes right now. Okay. You know, we've got a lot of questions. Do we want to go a few minutes over and do this?
I'm game.
All right, let's do it. What is the abbreviation for the car Pede form for rentals? Beth Newman.
I am checking. I think it's Pede LL, but I'm going to double check.
Okay. Stephen asks, if prospects come to the property several times, they need to sign a Pede each time. And did Neil say there was different Pede for showing rental tenant unit? If so, where found? Okay. So you're working on the.
So it looks like currently there's not. Hold. Sorry. Pardon me. It's the PEAD-LR, Coronavirus Lease Rental Property Entry Advisory and Declaration.
So there is a different form.
PEAD-LR.
Okay. So that sort of answers both, but I'll speak to the first part of that question. Every time someone comes into the property, they need to sign it because their situation may have changed. So.
Yeah, the guidance that I've been offering agents, you know, for Coldwell Banker is if they're coming back a second time on a different day, they should sign a new Pede.
That's right. Okay, Gigi asks, this was posted either on MLS or property website. So Cal OSHA has said the plan needs to be posted somewhere publicly. I know some people have been doing links to their MLS. Some people have been taking the last photo of their MLS or the last couple photos to show a sort of pictogram or an example or the actual content of the plan. You know, just as an end user, see what works for you. I do think it makes sense to have a pictogram visually, just because it is, you notice it. But, you know, use your best judgment. The requirements somehow require that it's disclosed publicly to the buyers upfront. And then again, I think smart to have it in your disclosure package.
Yeah, I actually think that if I remember correctly, it is an OSHA requirement that it be publicly posted, as you said. Hyperlinks are sometimes difficult if they're being fed out of the IDX feed to third-party websites. So they may be removed completely. So that may not be the most effective way of disseminating that information. Converting it into a JPEG and including it as a photo as part of your property showing is probably the safest way, at least as far as I'm aware of right now, to make sure that it ends up out on the third-party websites as well. Do keep in mind, if you have lots and lots of photos in the MLS, sometimes not all of the photos get syndicated out to those third-party websites. There might be a limit of a hard stop of 60 photos, 75 photos, 99 photos. And if your pictogram is photo 102, it's not getting out there. So just, you know, use best judgment. I just want to point out that potential problem.
Okay. Okay.
So Gigi, again, you know, talk with your broker about liability or your risk manager. I think, you know, we've made it clear where we're coming from.
Your read.
Thank you. The car pictogram does not show the need for shoe coverings, but they are mentioned in the after viewing section. So are they? I didn't see the bottom of the question. So are they needed?
Let's go back to the pictogram. So there has been, I think there's been a little bit of conflict on the shoe coverings between state and local, is my understanding. I would say shoe coverings is actually probably one of the easiest and most available things for you to get right now because most places aren't using them. You know, statewide, it's not featured in this, but I have seen it on local things. You know, there's a chance that could change. In general, I'd rather, you know, say be safe than sorry. We can go to our title companies, make a call to your title rep. They'd love to hear from you right now. Say, hey, can you send me some shoe coverings?
Yeah, and if they're not available, again, the idea is you would advise any prospective entrants ahead of their arrival that you're not able to provide that particular PPE, and assuming that the occupants or seller and the prospective buyer decide to go forward with, and I'm talking specifically about shoe coverings, you know, that's a risk-based decision that they're going to make. I do believe there is some clarification coming on the issue of shoe coverings. This was one of those issues where the plan that was originally put out by CAR with the covering, with the pictogram, there was some inconsistency. So I think there'll be some revisions coming in the next few days.
I think that's very true. Okay, anonymous. Buyers are contacting listing agents without representation and asking for full disclosures, although they are unknown persons to listing agent. Doesn't providing those docs, even to a buyer's agent you don't know who doesn't want to interact with you in advance, the full disclosures upon request, while knowing nothing about them, breach privacy for, say, tenants or sellers? Any concerns here? How does one protect the tenant, seller's, listing agent while walking a fine line to provide what is oftentimes essentially private documentation? So just to clarify, is the question about disclosing PEDs from other parties?
No, I think this is a callback to the presentation where we said, wherever possible, these things should be reviewed in advance of making the decision to go and view the property. And I do believe the question is about privacy. So, you know, this is a little bit of an onion question. There's a lot of different layers in there. The disclosure package, you know, when you're preparing disclosures about tenant applications, leases, very often those are not provided until after acceptance to people that you've had an opportunity to verify. So if the concern is specifically about revealing privacy information that is private to to a tenant, use good judgment there. Work with your manager or your risk manager on that. But what's in the disclosure package should have been approved by the seller in advance. You shouldn't just be willy-nilly putting things in a disclosure package. So the seller's aware of what's in there, and if they've instructed you to request that prospective visitors review that information prior to coming and viewing the property, you are following your principal's instructions.
And just a remark on disclosure packages, there are oftentimes, if you work with your broker and talk about, there are things that maybe should be redacted from documentation that aren't relevant. So if there's something that's personal and not relevant, talk to your risk manager about that, because I think that sometimes we see things show up in disclosure packages that probably should have been redacted.
Touche.
All right.
Anna provides some clarification. I'm in Contra Costa County, and the time frame I read was 1/2 hour. Better to check with the Contra Costa Board of Realtors. So there, for Rebecca,
right.
That's a callback to your question.
Okay. Thank you for clarifying. Great. Christina, do we have to sign the Pede ourselves even when we come in on our own into the property? Are you, the question is, are you the listing agent? Are you the buyer's agent? I would say sign it, just sign it, just complete it. Again, we're all living in the world and interacting and are human beings also, so we're not exceptions to this rule, really. I know it's an extra step, but it's also a good measure for us to think about, do we have any symptoms? Are we comfortable exposing the property or potentially another person, even with protective gear? Neil, do you have any remarks on that? As a listing agent, do you have remarks on that?
I think what Christina's maybe alluding to is the idea that if I'm the listing agent and I'm going into the property multiple times, do I have to sign the Pede every time? I mean, best practice would be, yes, you sign it every time. If you don't, you're potentially violating public policy. Steve asks, sorry, just to confirm, the plan consists of the Pede and the sign. Do we need to add additional information from our office? Thanks. So again, CAR's guidelines are that you use the pictogram and a copy of the Pede public as the plan. Your individual office may have other requirements. Check with your manager, or if you are the manager owner of your office, check with your risk manager to make sure that you're in compliance. But CAR's guidelines currently are that the pictogram and the Pede do constitute the plan. Mark says, gloves are available on Amazon.
Thanks, Mark. All right, anonymous. For a vacant property that hasn't hit the market yet, can the buyer's agent insist on walking around the yards, not the inside of the house? And do they still need to sign the Pede form? I think that's Pede. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
I'm going to jump on this. Yes.
Yeah, you can.
Yes. Like, I understand it's not inside of the property, but is the yard part of the property? Are they visiting the property? They need to review. They need to agree to comply with the plan. Well, and
just a second point on that about the buyer's agent insisting. I'm not sure of this specific scenario, but if a property hasn't hit the market yet and someone's insisting, it's also about having a conversation about your plan for marketing the property and everything apart from this.
Also, clear cooperation as another issue. If you aren't on the market, why are they there?
Right. There are a lot of sub issues there to delve into for another day. Mm-hmm. Okay. Kristen, must the Pedes be signed and delivered the same day of the showing, or can they be delivered the day prior? That's an interesting question.
I would take them the day prior, but best practice would be to have them sign it that day.
I think if you're the buyer's agent and your client says, I woke up feeling really crummy and I signed this thing yesterday, don't go to the property. Use common sense related to that. But what do you do when a couple has children? Do they have to go in one parent at a time, or are kids included in the count?
Kids are included in the count. They are people, and two people from one household. So if you have to break them up into two groups, that's fine. Very often and I know this can be difficult, but it probably, if it's at all viable, maybe not bring the kids to have the two decision makers there to see the property. But if it's if it's really necessary, you have to follow the 2-person plus an agent rule.
All right. Anonymous. Where's the best place to tape up the pictogram and Pede form at the property, at the entrance? I would say at the front door, wherever people will be coming in. So yes, it's the entrance.
And as a follow on to that, just, if it's a condominium or a condo complex, I think it's reasonable to put it on the unit door. I don't think you have to put it at in the common area door.
Okay.
How about for rental property after signing the Pede? How do I give to after showing the property to a future tenant? How about for rental property after signing the Pede? How do I give to after showing the property to a future tenant? After signing the Pede, how do I give to? Lynn, I'm sorry, I'm not sure that I understand the question. If you're still on, please try and clarify, and we'll happy to try and answer it. And
all right,
Mark says the MLS team is working with Rapatoni to include the car pictogram with all listings in the MLS, and we'll update everyone when and if the option becomes available. So hooray!
Great, thank you, Mark. Anonymous. A JPEG of the pictogram has to be one of the photos uploaded to the MLS listing. Is that what you said? We're saying that's a very simple way of complying with that aspect of the OSHA requirement.
Yeah.
So we're just suggesting that you will start seeing that, and it's a simple way to make sure that you're in compliance on that front. I still recommend putting the full plan in the disclosure package.
Oh, okay. So Lynn's following up. I mean, do I give to, and going back to the question, how about after rental property, after signing the Pede, do I give?
It's you deliver to the listing agent. So whoever is listing the property for rent, much like a listing agent, you would deliver that Pede if you're representing the prospective tenant or buyer.
Yeah, and if you are representing the landlord, you should be receiving the Pedes and keeping them in your file so that if there was a question, you have that paper trail of people who came to see the property.
That's right. And you can always also, if you're representing the landlord, you can send blank copies out if someone's unable to get a copy, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Anonymous. Should listing agent or buyer's agent be turning on all of the lights ahead of a showing?
The listing agent should be the one who is turning on all the lights, assuming they're the one who is responsible for wiping down all of the high-touch surfaces. That's where OSHA is saying is responsibility. It could also be a designated person like the seller or the occupant, but somebody should be doing that. You want to minimize the chance of somebody going and touching switches, and by having the lights on, it's the easiest way to get that done. Also, you want to have lights on, especially in dark areas, in case there's a chance that somebody might slip, fall, or hurt themselves. So it's just, whoever is responsible for wiping down should probably be the one to turn them on.
Okay, great. Should blank Pede forms be included in the disclosure package? You could put a blank Pede form in there.
If it's part of the plan, yeah.
Right.
It should. I think should is not the right word. You could. Again, the obligation is that the listing agent keep all of the forms or for the benefit of the seller for their file of everybody who has come to see the property. If they're turning in Pedes, you should be keeping those. If that's the most convenient way for you to distribute a copy of the plan by having the Pede and the pictogram in your disclosure package so that it can be reviewed ahead of time, certainly is a reasonable approach.
Okay. Christina follows up, yes, as a listing agent.
I don't remember. I can't recall.
That was a question about whether or not you had to sign a Pede every time you went in the property.
Got it.
I think, yeah, Neil's response is accurate. I think also just considering if you're coming in between, then you're a new person. Like if there's interplay between different people coming to the property, then there is potential exposure here. So mindful of that.
Doug says Amazon's taking a long time. My masks took 8 weeks to arrive. Yeah, I mean, I understand it's difficult to get PPE out there in the real world. With regards to masks, you can certainly, there's lots of videos on how to make a homemade mask, and that does meet the requirement. Gloves, I think, are more available. So, you're going to have to do your own research. I think the follow-up question is PPE stuff at Kamei on south side of Clement. 500. There you go, Doug. You can go to Kamei over in the Richmond district. So you have some options. All right. Thanks, Lynn. Appreciate it. Can we have a copy of today's materials? Sure.
Sure.
We'll ask Genevieve to send it out. Yep.
What someone's asking about the pictogram. So
if you look at the screen right now, you can see what the pictogram is. And the pictogram is. Yep.
Oh, sorry.
I was going to say it's available from the CAR website. So.
There also was a copy of it included in yesterday's SFAR update that covers these topics.
Yep.
And that update that was emailed to everybody has links to the source documents of the rules. So feel free to peruse those the
OSHA guidelines are 10 pages long. So, there's a lot of rules in there, but we've really done our best to summarize this in a way that's going to empower you to go out and show property. Before I see, it looks like Matthew didn't get a chance to answer that question or follow up. Marcia, if you can just go to the last slide, I'll hit those last 3.
Sure, that's great.
So this is a common question I get. And Anonymous says, First Republic Bank is giving out gloves to clients.
Oh,
there you go. So just open a bank account, get some gloves. Does the listing agent need to be present? So if the listing agent is the one that's going to be responsible for wiping down surfaces in between the showings, they're going to have to physically go to the property at some point to perform that activity. Or if they've designated somebody who is capable of doing that and has taken responsibility for it, then they don't have to. But in the absence of that, the listing agent should be present. And obviously, appointments are by appointment. Let's quickly, actually, this brings up another question. If you're using a super lockbox with the call before showing code, remember to wipe down the lockbox. Right? It's not technically in the property, but everyone's touching it. So I think that's a good one. Next question is, what if visitors aren't complying with the plan? So in this situation, a visitor shows up and they're not wearing a mask or they're refusing to wash hands. Should you physically stop them? Should you bar them from entering? I will give you the answer that my company is giving, which is you should not physically stop somebody from doing something. But what you should do is report it to the owner. The owner can do something about it, report them to the police or OSHA for somebody not trespassing or violating the plan, not complying with the plan. I do think you have an obligation to advise any subsequent visitors of the fact that somebody did not comply with the plan who had previously visited. So if you've scheduled several showings over a period of time, and somebody has forced their way in and to see the property, like, this is ridiculous, I don't need to wear a mask. You do, I believe, have an obligation to report it to any subsequent visitors in order to protect them. And then the last question is, what if another agent or brokerage isn't complying with regulations? And so in this instance, I know that the DRE has come out and said that they are in support of OSHA's guidelines. Obviously they could be reported to the DRE. They can be reported to OSHA. Arguably, there's an ethics violation if somebody is not complying with the ethical standards that have been set out by NAR. So there's a chance they may end up in front of pro standards. So those are different ways that we can help ensure that everyone is complying.
And just to that point, and to sort of wrap this up real quickly, I know we're over. Appreciate everyone staying on. The sort of repercussion side of this is multifaceted, but the real overarching important theme here is these are small steps we can take to make everybody safer. Ourselves, our clients, everyone should be willing to participate for the greater good of our community. And so, I know a lot of people said, well, am I going to be fined? And it's like, well, irrespective of whether or not you'll be financially penalized, there are broader and and sort of overarching penalties to the health risk. So let's just stay safe. Let's be smart. Let's take care of our clients, take care of ourselves, and sell some property.
You're here. Thanks. Thanks to everyone who attended. We really appreciate it. This video will be posted to the association's YouTube page. And feel free to reach out to, I think Marcia would agree, either of us if you have questions or you want to have further conversation. And just like Marcia suggested, let's be safe and let's sell lots of property.
All right. Bye, guys.